Difficulty in video games is a tough balancing act. Developers need to come up with modes that cater to the skills and preferences of a bunch of different types of players, which can cause some to be too hard or too easy for the average gamer. However, sometimes balancing a game can go so poorly that its intended hard setting turns out to be easier than any other difficulty. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video game hard modes that make games easier. Number 10. Difficulty makes farming rare items easier. The Binding of Isaac. Items are a major aspect of the Binding of Isaac. Which random things you get and how you combine them together can make or break a run, which is why most players choose to prioritize acquisition over increasing health. It's also why playing on harder difficulties makes the game easier. When you play Isaac on hard mode, the game has a much higher chance of spawning a boss room and other more challenging chambers. On paper, that certainly sounds like it makes things harder, as you're more frequently forced to take on more difficult enemies. However, because clearing boss chambers is how you get new items, this increased frequency makes it easier to farm overpowered equipment. The game might be a little harder at first, but with regular item drops, it actually becomes a lot simpler to gather good items until you've basically constructed a run that clears the entire game by itself. It goes without saying that at that point, additional boss rooms become nothing more than item farms for adding even more ridiculous buffs and new abilities to your all-powerful setup, but I mean, take the W if you decided to play on a higher difficulty. Number 9. Opening a well of possibilities. Valkyrie Profile Lenneth. Valkyrie Profile Lenneth is the PSP conversion of the original PlayStation RPG simply called Valkyrie Profile. Aside from tuning the game to a more modern console, Lenneth tweaks its difficulty in a pretty interesting way, one that, ironically, flips the scaling of a challenge on its head. Unlike your typical difficulty progression, Lenneth's easy, normal, and hard modes don't have anything to do with changing the strength of the enemies. Instead, the game tweaks a whole variety of different gameplay elements. From the amount of experience you gain to how many dungeons you encounter, how many people you can have in your party, and even what items you can find. The experience you gain is intuitively lowered the harder the game is, but strangely enough, the other limitation or unlockable recruits and items is made less restrictive on hard mode. Lenneth's easy mode is an incredibly streamlined experience compared to hard, and it greatly limits your access to new characters and makes it impossible to gain certain items. These become available only in hard mode, and since these exclusive goodies are oftentimes way more powerful than anything you'd get in easy mode, it's actually less difficult to finish the game on its most difficult setting. Number 8. Harder enemies means faster leveling. Lord of the Rings: The Third Age. Lord of the Rings: The Third Age is a 2004 RPG based on J.R.R. Tolkien's world of Middle-earth. The title's hard mode isn't anything spectacular. Like in most games, it mostly just buffs the enemy units, making them bulkier and more resistant to damage, so trickier for you. That said, because the leveling system in the Third Age utilizes more original ideas, the basic changes in hard mode actually cause something pretty interesting to happen. You see, leveling up your characters isn't based on experience points. Instead, the progress you make towards a new level depends on how many times you use the character's abilities. Now, because on hard mode enemies have more health and are more resistant to damage, you're inevitably going to have more opportunities to use skills against them. In turn, what that means is that you're going to level up faster and reach your party's full potential a lot easier than you would if you were playing on a lower difficulty. The rate of progression is so rapid, in fact, that even after the first few battles, your characters will be way ahead of anything you could achieve on easy. And once you hit max level halfway through, pretty much nothing can stop you. Number 7. Once you perfect parry, you can't go back. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance's hard mode might be challenging at first, but once you get accustomed to it, playing it will actually be easier than if you were playing on any other difficulty. In the highest difficulty mode called Revengeance, enemies are more aggressive and you deal significantly less damage to them. However, to balance things out, you also gain a major advantage in that performing perfect parries deals an insane amount of damage, enough to even kill bosses in a single strike. Perfect parries are obviously tricky to master, which is why most people will genuinely have a difficult time playing on Revengeance. However, as soon as you do get used to parrying and get good at blocking the enemy at the right moment, the hardest difficulty will become the easiest setting. Since most enemies will die from a single strike, you don't have to worry so much about them being more aggressive. If anything, it gives you more opportunities to parry. You can also finish the game significantly faster and not have to worry about any tactics when fighting bosses. Once you beat the game on Revengeance, easier modes actually become harder, as all of a sudden your signature parry move loses all of its lethal capabilities. Number 6. The odds are more than 1,000, Diablo III. As many entries on this list have shown, changing the drop rate of rare items can have a massive impact on the difficulty of a game. However, when it comes to finding the most extreme case of this, the king of absolutely broken legendary drop rates has to be Diablo III. The game's hardest difficulty is called Torment, and it's divided into 16 increasingly more soul-crushing levels of intensity, and the player can set this at the start of the session. The higher the level of Torment, the greater the strength of the monsters, but also the drop rate of legendary loot. At level 16, the chance of spawning rare legendaries is turned up to over 1220%, meaning you're pretty much guaranteed to get legendary items at every corner you visit. If you know which items to look out for, depending on which season the game is in, you can easily power scale your character early and then create a snowball effect that turns you into an unkillable demigod. The highest Torment level is high risk, high reward, but at a certain point, the broken odds of legendary drops make it high reward only. Number 5. The hardest difficulty makes it easier for Korean speakers. Crysis. Crysis's approach to hard mode is an interesting one, as the game doesn't only adjust the enemy's combat mechanics, it also changes the way they speak, which, funnily enough, can make the mode easier for certain types of people who speak a certain language. When you pick hard for your playthrough, the enemy soldiers gain buffs to their reaction time and accuracy. The game also makes it harder to detect them and predict their actions, and it does so by removing the ability to mark them, as well as making the Korean soldiers actually speak their native language. Now, the latter change may sound like a pretty fun concept that could make the game more difficult if it weren't for the fact that, there are actual Koreans and Korean speakers playing the game. The soldiers coordinating their actions in a language that you can understand can make the game easier, as the hostiles will be easier to understand. To those who can't speak a lick of Korean, the game may seem significantly more unpredictable, but to native speakers, it does the opposite. Number 4. Legendary makes using exploits easier. The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Bethesda games' difficulty settings are frequently criticized for being lazy slider adjustments, and Legendary mode in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim is no different. All the difficulty does is make your attacks weaker and your enemies stronger, which can actually lead to a lot of gameplay issues, like spells dealing marginal damage and kill cams triggering when you're not even close to killing someone. Still, as is the case with most Bethesda bugs into features, this lack of balance can actually be exploited in your favor. Since on Legendary you deal less damage not only to your enemies but also to your allies, you're able to get a lot of free cheap shots at them before they get angry with you. Knowing that, you can flail your weapons at them to level up your combat skills without aggroing anyone. And if you manage to get your blades on an essential follower that never attacks you, like Hadvar or Ralof in the intro, you basically get a huge damage sponge that will endlessly take hits, allowing you to level up in an instant. After you max out your skills like that, the legendary stat challenges won't even make a difference. Number 3. Hard mode turns your blaster into a super weapon. Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. Star Wars Shadows of the Empire is a 1997 third-person shooter set in a galaxy far, far away. It features several difficulty settings which scale from easy all the way to a special hard mode called Jedi. The Jedi difficulty is the last mode you unlock in the game, and it's supposed to offer the player a much more realistic experience, where you and your enemies become much more susceptible to damage. Now, you might think this would make the game harder, since enemies can kill you in just a couple of hits, but in reality, the balance of power is actually more in your favor than it is on lower difficulty settings. While it's true that enemies in Jedi mode only need 2 hits to down your character, your blast is also stronger, and the increased damage is pretty darn significant, as you're able to kill everything in just one shot. Because of this, beating Shadows of the Empire on Jedi is way easier and much faster than doing the same thing on regular hard mode. You also don't have to worry too much about being a glass cannon, as you can take a hit or two, while everything in your sight has no option but to die to the deadliest superweapon in the galaxy. Nice. Number 2, a legendary loot spawner, Fallout 4. Fallout 4's approach to difficulty is pretty much identical to other Bethesda games, that is, unbalanced slider adjustments equal harder enemies. However, it also utilizes one unique mechanic, which actually changes the gameplay around drastically, and that is, yeah, you can say it with me at this point, it makes it significantly easier for you. While the game has scaling enemies like raiders that become beefier when someone puts scum next to their name, it also features special enemies referred to as legendaries. These legendary hostiles are unique in that they regain health after they lose more than half of it, but more importantly, they drop legendary loot when you kill them. Legendary arms come with a randomly generated ability that, if you're lucky, can be an absolute game changer that'll make every encounter a piece of cake, like, for example, an automatic rifle that shoots explosive ammunition. The problem is that legendary enemies are extremely rare. That is, unless you play on hard. Yep, aside from adjusting enemy stats, hard mode also increases the possibility of spawning a legendary character, making it easier to farm for unique items until you find the one that'll help you beat the game with ease, regardless of how unfairly buff enemies are. Number 1, a tale of two hard modes, Devil May Cry 3. Devil May Cry 3 is a curious entry on our list, as depending on which version of the game you're playing, hard mode can turn out to be less difficult than normal mode. You see, back in 2005 when Devil May Cry 3 was just being released, Capcom made a decision to tweak the difficulty setting for each localization of the title. Whereas the Japanese version had standard easy, normal, and hard settings, the American audience received a version where easy and normal mode were the equivalent of the Japanese hard mode, and their version of the last setting was ramped up to an even more brutal extent. The decision was motivated by American return policy, which allowed people to fully refund a game after 30 days. Capcom feared that the Japanese difficulty would allow people to beat the game too fast and then return it. However, after the Western audience had complained that the game was too hard, a unified version of the game for all countries was released, which lowered the difficulty for all. That's why if you play an older version of Devil May Cry 3 in America, you might be surprised to find out easy and normal modes are much more intense than the modern hard setting.